and welcome back. So we have had seen how Gilbert Ryle has been criticized for his key themes, right from behavioralist position to category mistake against Cartesian dualism, which only tells us that none of the philosophers are thus proved. It is always open-ended, and that is the richness of philosophy. Now, at this juncture, it is important that we address what exactly or how exactly did Gilbert Ryle criticize René Descartes. We have seen the Rylean criticisms. Now we will see how did Ryle critique René Descartes. Gilbert Ryle employed the concept of category mistake to critique Descartes' dualistic view of mind and body. Ryle's argument asserted that Descartes misrepresented the nature of mental processes by categorizing the mind as a separate, non-physical entity. In Ryle's view, this led to confusion about what mental states are and how they relate to behavior. He provided several examples to illustrate this concept, and right now we will be focusing on these very significant illustrations. So we will be in this segment picking up 4 examples which are often associated with Ryle's critique, who had critically discussed to highlight their strengths and limitations. The first, this is the very well-known example which shines brightest in the concept of the mind, and it is the university example. So the example goes somewhere like this. Ryle describes the mistake of someone visiting a university and asking where the university is. After having seen the buildings and interacted with the students and faculty, this question implies a misunderstanding of what a university is, as it is not merely a collection of buildings, but rather an institution defined by its functions, relationships, and activities. So, when we critically discuss the university example, we will like to see the strengths of it. The first, this example effectively illustrates how one can confuse categories, as universities cannot be understood solely by their physical components. It showcases how Descartes treats the mind as a separate substance rather than seeing it as a part of a larger functional system involving behaviors and interactions. Limitations of the university example. Some critics argue that the analogy might oversimplify the nature of mental processes. While the university represents a collective function, mental states involve subjective experiences that do not fit straightforwardly into the notion of social functions. This example may overlook the complexity and richness of internal mental experiences. Explanation of Ryle's critique of Descartes. We know that his Concept of the Mind, 1949, where he had argued against the mind-body dualism, Ryle claimed that Descartes made a category mistake by treating the mind and body as 2 separate entities, when in fact the mind is not a distinct substance, but rather a way of talking about certain aspects of human behavior. So, the university example, if we further elaborate on it, we understand that typically a visitor might see various buildings like the library, the laboratories, the dormitories on a university campus, and then ask, but where is the university? The mistake is treating the university as a separate entity when it is actually the sum of these parts. The example of the university is one of the most famous illustrations Gilbert Ryle used to explain the concept of a category mistake. This concept is crucial to Ryle's critique of René Descartes' mind-body dualism in his book, The Concept of the Mind. So, we would like to dwell on this university example a little bit more, for I had already mentioned that it is one of the brightest shining examples of category mistake. So what then is this university example all about? What is it that we are discussing? How is the university example related to category mistake? So the scenario is, imagine a person who has never visited a university before. This person is given a tour of a university campus. During the tour, they are shown the library, laboratories, lecture halls, dorms, administrative offices, classrooms, so on and so forth, and other buildings. After seeing all these individual parts of the campus, the visitor turns to the guide and asks, "But where is the university?" This very question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding which Ryle calls a category mistake. The visitor mistakenly assumes that the university is something in the same category as the buildings, the library, laboratories, and so on and so forth, as though the university should be a separate, tangible object that exists alongside these structures. However, the university is not another object or building that can be pointed out in the same way as the library or the classrooms. The university is the collective name for the institution, which is composed of all the buildings, the staff, the students, and their activities. It is an abstract concept representing the organization, functions, and relationships between all these elements, not an additional physical object that can be observed. Why does this matter? Ryle uses this example of the university to demonstrate how people can misunderstand the nature of certain concepts by thinking of them as things of the wrong category. In the case of the university, the mistake is in thinking that the university should be a physical object like the buildings on campus, rather than understanding it as a complex system or institution that consists of all these elements working together. Ryle applied this idea of category mistakes to criticize Descartes' view of the mind. Descartes had argued that the mind and body are two separate substances, the mind being immaterial and the body being material. Ryle argued that this is a category mistake, just as the university is not a separate entity from the buildings, the mind is not a separate substance from the body. According to Ryle, the mind should be understood in terms of behavior and dispositions, not as an independent entity that exists alongside the body. In summary, the university example illustrates how misunderstandings can arise when we incorrectly categorize complex systems as simple objects. Ryle used this to show that Descartes' separation of mind and body was based on a similar misunderstanding, where the mind was wrongly categorized as a separate entity rather than being understood as a way of talking about certain kinds of behavior. Now we are going ahead with the second example, which is the cricket match. In this setting, a person might see individual players, the pitch and the scoreboard, and then ask, "But where is the team spirit?" The mistake is thinking that team spirit is a separate entity rather than something that emerges from the action of the team. The cricket match example is yet another illustration used by Gilbert Ryle to explain the concept of a category mistake. This example further develops his critique of René Descartes' mind-body dualism by showing how people can mistakenly treat abstract concepts as though they were concrete physical entities. The scenario. Let us spend some more time about the second example of category mistake, the cricket match. Imagine someone who is unfamiliar with the game of cricket. They attend a cricket match for the first time and observe various elements: the players on the field, the cricket pitch, the stumps, the ball, and the scoreboard displaying the scores. They might also notice the strategies, coordination, and interaction among the players. After watching all of these, the person might ask, quote, "But where is the team spirit?" unquote. The question, "Where is the team spirit?" reveals a misunderstanding known as category mistake. The person is mistakenly treating team spirit as if it were a physical object that could be pointed out or seen separately from the players and the game. They are thinking of team spirit as though it were a tangible entity, like a player or a piece of equipment that exists in addition to the players and the match. However, the team spirit is not a separate physical entity. It is an abstract concept that refers to the morale, unity, and cooperative attitude of the team members. It is something that emerges from the collective actions, attitudes, and interactions of the players as they work together towards a common goal. It cannot be located or pointed as an individual object because it is not something that exists in the same category as physical objects like the pitch, ball, or players. So why does this example matter? The second example of the cricket match matters for it helps to illustrate how people can misinterpret abstract concepts by placing them in the wrong category. In the case of the cricket match, the mistake is in thinking that team spirit should be an observable object rather than understanding it as a quality or attribute that arises from the behavior and attitudes of the team members. Ryle uses this type of category mistake to critique Descartes' theory of mind-body dualism. Descartes argued that the mind is a non-physical substance that exists separately from the body. Ryle, however, contended that this is a category mistake. Just as team spirit is not a separate entity from the players and their actions, the mind is not a separate substance from the body. According to Ryle, the mind is better understood as a way of talking about certain behaviors, dispositions, and capabilities of the body rather than as an independent entity. Thus, the cricket match example is used to illustrate how misunderstandings arise when we mistakenly categorize abstract concepts as if they were physical objects. Ryle employed this example to argue that Descartes made a similar error in treating the mind as a separate substance from the body rather than understanding the mind as an expression of the body's capacities and behaviors. Just as team spirit emerges from the collective actions of team, Ryle argued that mental states are simply ways of describing certain behaviors and dispositions, not separate entities. Now we will be engaging on the third example, which was used by Ryle to talk about the category mistake, and that is the march past. Now, what is this march past example all about? An observer might see soldiers marching in various formations and then ask, but where is the parade? The parade is not an additional entity. It is the collective activity of the soldiers. The march past example is yet another illustration used by Gilbert Ryle to clarify the concept of a category mistake, which is central to his critique of Cartesian mind-body dualism. This example helps to demonstrate how abstract concepts are often misunderstood when they are mistakenly treated as physical objects or entities. Now, what is this scenario of the march past? Imagine someone watching a military parade for the first time. The observer sees soldiers marching in various formations with precision and coordination. They might observe the soldiers in their uniforms, the flags being carried, the sound of the marching band, and the synchronized movements of the troops. After taking in all these elements, the observer might ask, but where is the parade? The question, where is the parade, reveals a category mistake. The observer is mistakenly treating the parade as if it were a separate physical object or entity that could be pointed out like a soldier, a flag, or a band instrument. They are thinking of the parade as though it should exist as an independent thing in addition to the matching soldiers and their coordinated movements. However, the parade is not a separate additional entity. It is the name given to the collective activity of the soldiers marching in formation, the music being played by the band, and the overall coordination of the event. The parade is not something that exists independently of these activities. It is the very organization and execution of these actions that constitute the parade. The parade is the sum of these coordinated activities, not a separate object. So why does this third example of the parade matter? This example of the march past illustrates how people can misunderstand the nature of certain concepts by wrongly categorizing them. In this case, the mistake is in thinking that the parade is an additional physical object when in fact it is an emergent property of the soldiers' coordinated actions. Ryle used examples like these to criticize Descartes' theory of mind-body dualism. Descartes argued that the mind is a distinct non-physical substance that exists separately from the body. Ryle argued that this is a category mistake. Just as the parade is not something separate from the marching soldiers, the mind is not something separate from the body. According to Ryle, the mind should be understood in terms of the behaviors, dispositions, and activities of the body, not as a distinct substance. In the context of the Descartes dualism, Descartes viewed the mind as an independent, non-physical substance that interacts with the body. Ryle, however, argued that the mind is not an additional entity. Instead, mental activities are expressions of physical processes and behaviors, just as the parade is an expression of the soldiers' movements. Ryle thus suggested that when we talk about the mind, we are not referring to a separate, mysterious substance, but rather to the ways in which a person behaves, reacts, and engages with the world. This view is sometimes referred to as a form of behaviorism, where mental states are seen as dispositions to behave in certain ways rather than as internal, non-physical entities. So, the march past example serves to illustrate how category mistakes can lead to confusion about the nature of abstract concepts. Ryle used this example to show that just as the parrot is not a separate entity from the soldier's coordinated actions, the mind is not a separate substance from the body. By understanding the mind as a way of describing certain kinds of behavior, Ryle argued that we avoid the category mistake that Descartes made in his mind-body dualism. We are now coming up with yet another key feature or key essence of the Rylean philosophy, and that was the derogatory remark of the ghost in the machine. Ryle famously critiqued the idea of the mind as a non-physical entity residing in a physical body, calling this view the ghost in the machine. He argued that this conception misplaces the mind in a separate category from the body, leading to the category mistake. So now let us understand the critical discussion, the strengths of these discussion. The metaphor ghost in the machine succinctly captures the absurdity of treating the mind as a distinct entity divorced from bodily functions. Ryle's argument emphasizes the error of believing in a dualistic separation between the mental and physical realms, which promotes a clearer understanding of the mind as a part of the holistic functioning. The ghost in the machine metaphor has been critiqued for being overtly dismissive of legitimate philosophical concerns regarding subjective experience and consciousness. Critics argue that while Ryle correctly identifies the misallocation of categories, he may still fail to account for the deeply felt experiences individuals have that seem to transcend mere behavioral descriptions. The last example has been the missing heron example. Ryle presents a hypothetical situation where someone describes a person who is a skilled fencer but then insists that they have never witnessed the fencing. In asking where the skill resides, it implies a misunderstanding, as the skill manifests itself in performances, not as a separate entity. So the missing heron example in the critical discussion, the strengths are, this example illustrates how skills or mental states are demonstrated through behavior rather than existing as independent, unseen entities. It points to a more practical understanding of mental processes as inherently tied to action and ability. Limitations. Critics argue that this analogy does not capture the internal aspect of knowledge and skill. It may ignore the importance of cognitive and introspective processes that contribute to one's skills. The mental state of skill might also include elements of consciousness, memory, and learning that cannot be wholly described by observable behavior. The fifth, the electrician example. Ryle famously critiqued the idea of the mind as a non-physical entity residing in a physical body, calling this view the ghost in the machine. He argued that this conception misplaces the mind in a separate category from the body, leading to a category mistake. This example effectively underscores the idea that understanding mental states should focus on the associated actions and functions rather than searching for an abstract, separate mental existence. It highlights the role of context in understanding mental activities or functions. Critics might contend that this analogy simplistically portrays the relationship between the mind and behavior. The complexities surrounding mental activities, particularly in context of introspection or non-behavioral cognitive processes, may not be fully addressed through this example. The electrician, like the mind, may have aspects that remain invisible and unobservable emphasizing the analogy is not perfect. So Ryle's use of category mistakes against Descartes is a powerful method of critiquing Cartesian dualism, providing accessible and illustrative examples to challenge the separation of mind and body. Each example sheds light on Ryle's central argument, emphasizing that mental states should be understood through their behavioral manifestations. However, the limitations of these examples illustrate the ongoing philosophical challenges in thoroughly accounting for the complexities of consciousness, subjective experience, and the multifaceted nature of mental life. Challenges that have inspired further debates in philosophy of mind long after Ryle's time. Descartes premised his theory on two assumptions: that the world is a mechanical place and the method of doubt is the only route that arrives at true knowledge. Within these assumptions, the philosophical questions arose. Descartes was a skeptic. He did not want to accept as true anything remotely susceptible of doubt. He believed the skeptic principle should be accepted because it is the rational thing to do. To not accept this principle is to make oneself susceptible to manipulation. Descartes began to wonder about the source of his beliefs and eventually arrived to the realization that our beliefs are all sourced from sense perception. One other source, he argued, was the intellect. The intellect was a very special human ability for Descartes. This ability came to become key for the justification of the mechanical world. We came to find that the world is mechanical through the intellect. Therefore, Descartes had concluded that the intellect is the only source of knowledge. So we do see that Gilbert Ryle had given his own arguments, his own settings, his own ideas through the various four rebuttals that we had just about talked, and this is enough and more to understand why Gilbert Ryle continues to be one of the most important figures, for he as a behaviorist had strong objections to Cartesian dualism, and both Ryle and Descartes agreed that the world is mechanical. The difference, however, lies in where they believe the mind lies. Ryle takes issue with four of Descartes' claims about the mind, and he had definitely shown the same. Ryle rebuttals thus with his color example. Secondly, he takes issue with the epistemic claim that knowledge of space is approximate, uncertain, and challengeable, and that the mind is transparent, certain, and 100% private. In these two claims were true, we would not have psychology or neuroscience, because we would never be able to tell that someone is happy or anxious. However, we can tell because we can see it in their behavior. So to Ryle, this was a big issue, and he did come up in his own way. Thus, Ryle creates the university example to defend his claim, and we all see how he had done it. So to add on at the next, we can of course argue and see that as much as the Cartesian dualism have had its effect, the Rylean criticism too have had its effect. If René Descartes has blessed with the Cartesian dualism, Gilbert Ryle had made it richer by critiquing the Cartesian dualism. For criticisms and open-ended discussions are what that makes philosophy get going. Thank you so much, and with this we end the series of the criticisms by Gilbert Ryle against the Cartesian dualism. Thank you so much.